Okay. Good afternoon. I'm not sure if you're getting the feedback that I am, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We're really happy to have Avi Friedman here from Wolfsdorf Rosenthal. We've been working with their firm for many, many years, and I'm sure this will be a great webinar. Avi's an expert on the topic. And because of the feedback, I'm going to turn it over to him now to get started.
Okay, Avi, it's all yours. Great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Very happy to be here, and thanks for those that are live and here in person, and hello to everyone else over Zoom. Today's topic, as you can see, hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint, is consular and CBP admission updates for this year. And really quick legal disclaimer. So everything that we talk about today is not legal advice. It's really for informational purposes only. And if you have a specific legal issue that you would like an opinion on for your set of circumstances, best to schedule an actual consultation with one of our attorneys. A little bit about our firm, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself too. I'm a partner with Wolfsdorf Rosenthal, or WR Immigration, since that's a bit of a mouthful. And we handle everything from, our main focus is US immigration, and we also have been expanding into global, which is outbound. Let's say you wanted to work in another country and needed a visa to work or travel there. And we're very technology centric. We've created our own proprietary software and apps, trying to make the immigration process as streamlined as possible. So again, my name is Avi. My last name is Friedman, and I went to Loyola Law School. And prior to that, I went to undergraduate at UCLA many years ago. And you can see a couple of my credentials. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to actually travel to various U.S. embassies and consulates. They used to allow attorneys to go inside, and I've been at the interview window with visa applicants, helped many international students with their F1 visas in person. I've also traveled and continue to travel to the border and have processed with Customs and Border Protection for the admission process, and have helped clients with that as well. So a lot of experience there. During the pandemic, things did slow down and things changed, and we'll talk about some of the changes and what to expect from that perspective. You have my contact info there, Avi at wolfsdorf.com, or Friedman at wolfsdorf.com is usually the best way to get in touch with me if you have follow-up questions that we don't get to today. And so what are we going to talk about today on our agenda? And you can see here an overview. We're going to talk about the visa interview in general, and what are some considerations you should take into account when you're applying either for your first or renewing of a non-immigrant visa. We'll talk about the aftermath of the pandemic of COVID-19 and how it impacted the visa world. We'll talk about some options that you have for what's called third country national visa processing, or TCN, meaning applying in a place other than your normal home country. The consequences of the Ukraine war. We'll talk about administrative processing, what that means and how it impacts the visa process. And then we'll move on after the visa side of things. We'll talk about Customs and Border Protection issues and what to expect when you're traveling back to the United States. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Since we're live here, I will be able to address, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. And if you're on Zoom, either through the chat or Q&A, Wes will also be moderating questions. So you could see this is, for those who haven't been in front of a U.S. consular officer, this is a typical picture of a visa window. And so you as the visa applicant are on one side, consular officer is on the other side. There's this thick bulletproof glass window, and there's a tray to slide documents back and forth. And these interviews really are very quick, 2-3 minutes. A lot of time, the consular officer has 100 people in the waiting room, and they started at 8, they got to finish by 12, they want to go to lunch. So they're trying to clear the waiting room. They only have a couple minutes for a visa interview. So if you've applied for your visa, if you remember, the main form is called the DS-160. That's the online visa application form. And so you're going to see the consular officer looking at their screen. They may not even say anything to you. They're going to be reviewing their screen, may ask you a couple questions. They may ask for some documents as backup. And you're going to see them typing up notes as they conduct the interview. So they may ask you a couple questions. And so it's very important, from the consular officer's perspective, how they perceive you interviewing. And so because they only have this couple minutes to conduct the interview. And so you should never assume, even if it's a renewal. So let's say you've had your F1 before and you need to renew your F1 visa for whatever reason it is. There's no such thing as a sure thing in the visa world. Every time you apply before a visa officer, it's a new adjudication. So even in a renewal sense, they're going to run through all your qualifications and all these various security checks before they can issue the visa. And there's always going to be some risk involved in the visa process. So a couple of visa interview tips here. Again, considering how little time you have before the officer, number one, you always want to be honest. You always want to be very polite, very respectful to the consular officer. Be on time for the interview, because sometimes if you're late, you'll miss your appointment. Goes without saying, and I know everyone is, but be very nice, be polite. These are consular officers are part of what's called the diplomatic corps. And so, they're trained to work at a U.S. embassy or consulate, and they're underneath the ambassadors, and consul generals. And so they're, how you act to them and how you talk to them is very important, to be very respectful. And also when you, when you're dressing up for the interview, you don't want to just show up in t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops. Maybe it's okay for campus life, but for the visa interview, treat it as if you're going to a business meeting, a business interview. You want to look professional. You want to look clean cut. I do think consular officers, they take all of these various things into account, whether it's fair or not. It's just how the visa world works. And sometimes part of the challenge is just getting into the U.S. embassy or consulate. They have very strict rules for security. So a lot of times, no bags, no briefcases, no backpacks, no car keys, no cell phones. There's very few places from a consulate perspective that will allow you to bring in electronic devices. See if we can fix that. It says I'm screen sharing. So
I'm not saying this.
so live we see it, right? But should I stop share and reset? Okay. Okay.
Okay, there we go.
We're good?
Yeah.
And I'll flip it. But it's not allowing me to advance. Advance. It's not advancing. Can you see that slide, the next one?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're on. All right, so should I go back so they could see the other slides?
We can make it available.
Okay, yeah, I can send you the one. All right, so we're going to move on to preparing for international travel. It's easy, for me to say, but to be honest, if you can avoid international travel and stepping foot inside a U.S. embassy or consulate, that's always going to be the safest. If you've got a valid visa, that's good. But if you have to renew your visa, you have to take some of these factors into consideration. And number one is to try to minimize delays on your end. You have to be absolutely sure you've got all your documents prepared. So what do you need? Well, number one is you've got to have a valid passport, and that's got to be valid for at least 6 months from the date that you plan to return back to the United States. If you're applying for a visa, you got to make sure you've got at least a couple of blank pages in your passport, because sometimes they print a visa and it has a mistake. They need a clean page in your passport, cannot have any stamps on it for them to be able to print a visa on it. If you're got a valid visa, that's great. If you're an F1 international student, you need a valid I-20. It's got to have a signature that's valid for travel, endorsed in the proper time frame. As you progress up, to other visa categories, if you have a work visa, you'll need your approval notice. For also, as a student, you should have your SEVIS fee receipt just in case the consul or the Customs and Border Protection officer asks for it. It's important to show evidence of maintenance of status. So if you've got all your prior I-20s, I would even print out just your class registration to show that you're a student in good standing if you're applying for a visa or traveling. If you're a permanent resident, you have your green card. So you want to make sure you've got a valid green card. So give yourself plenty of time to make sure that you've got all the necessary documents. From the actual visa interview side of things, you've got, after you complete the DS-160, you're going to print out the DS-160 barcode page, bring a recent color passport photo, proof of payment of the visa fee, bring a printout, physical printout of your appointment notice. Oftentimes there's clerks outside an embassy or consulate or security that are checking these documents. And so there's some good links here, usembassy.gov and this other one here. You can get a link to all the US embassies and consulates throughout the world. And then you want to go into the visa section pages. Every embassy and consulate has different rules and requirements. So you always want to get up to speed in terms of what's required. And you can also search wait times, what's called visa wait time. So you can punch in any of the US embassies or consulates and check what are their current wait times, let's say for an F1 for the first time, or where you require an interview, or they're doing interview waivers. They should give you an estimate, but they're never going to be exact. So sometimes it'll say one thing on the website, and when you actually go to book an appointment, it may not match. So take that into account as well. In terms of your documents, originals are critical. So your passport and any prior passports that contain US visas or US admission stamps. If you've got approval notices, let's say for work visas or change of status, you want to bring those. If you've ever lost a passport, you want to bring with you your police report showing that the passport was lost or stolen. If you've ever had any problems with police, ever been arrested or convicted, excuse me, you want to bring original documents, arrest report, and court dispositions to show what happened. If you're married or you have children and your dependents are applying for visas, then you will need their your marriage certificate or the children's birth certificates. If you have degrees from the US, you want to bring original degrees. Transcripts are very important for consular officers to review. All right, moving on to, what has really been the impact of the pandemic and COVID-19. And so, we saw a lot of new rules and regulations come out during the Trump administration. And a lot of consular officers were unhappy with, with what was going on in Washington and the leadership at Department of State. So many consular officers decided to resign. Some were laid off. And so they lost about 40% of their staff. You pair that together with local country conditions where consuls couldn't get to the embassy or consulate, or the local staff who were taking intake or biometrics couldn't get to work because of lockdowns. And so what that created was you'd have an appointment, appointments would get canceled, or you tried to book an appointment, you couldn't find an appointment. So that's what we were seeing during the pandemic. Fortunately, Department of State has gone and hired quite a bit more of foreign service personnel, training them to be consular officers. So we're going to start to see more staffing, excuse me, at the various consular posts. The percentages is that 96% of consular posts worldwide are again doing visa interviews in person. The numbers are getting back up. Department of State processed about 8 million non-immigrant visa applications through a year, if we go back a year from September of 2021 to September 22. So they're starting to get back on track, and they're also trying to create interview waivers for some visa categories as well. So we're seeing this, what I would call it, as a slow return to somewhat a normal visa processing. There's still backlogs in some countries, some of the major countries. Mexico, India, Brazil, you're going to see backlogs for certain visa categories, primarily for visitor visas. They do try to prioritize F1 visa appointments. And sometimes when you try to book an appointment, you're not going to find availability at all. You're just going to pay your visa fee. You look at the calendar and there's nothing available. So what do? You just have to keep checking, refresh. You're going to have to check morning, afternoon, evening, late at night. And eventually you may find an appointment. It may be far out in the future, but you'll find something. And so you want to book that first available appointment. And if it doesn't work with your travel schedule, you can go online, and all the embassies and consulates have a button where you can request an expedite, and you can put in the reasons why you need an earlier appointment. And a consular officer will actually consider whether to move up your appointment or not. So they'll give you an answer. And if there's an answer, they'll give you a new date. If not, they'll tell you the expedite's been denied. So again, we've got the visa wait times link. And then I did want to talk about TCN, or third country national visa appointments. So there is an option to apply for your visa outside the country where you're resident or a citizen of, and that's what a TCN means. And so in Mexico and Canada, there are U.S. embassies and consulates, and over the years, they have seen, besides their normal applicants would be Mexican citizens or Canadian citizens. In Mexico, they were used to seeing applicants from other countries, same with Canada. And so there are appointments available. The key thing is, in Canada, the appointment wait times for somebody who's not resident in Canada is quite long. So you're probably looking at a year out to get an F1 student appointment, unless you can qualify for an expedite or you catch a cancellation. Mexico, their rules have been that prior to the pandemic, they only accepted renewals of same category visas. So for instance, you had an F1 visa issued in the past, you wanted to renew your F1, that was allowed. But let's say you had an F1 visa and you graduated, you did your OPT and you changed status to H1B, that wasn't going to be permitted because that's the first time H1B visa application. It's not a renewal of your H1, so that wasn't being allowed in Mexico. During the pandemic, we did see that Mexico was trying to limit even regular TCN appointments. So as of now, officially on their website, they're not accepting TCNs. You can request a special appointment, and if you qualify, but otherwise you're looking at Canada. But Department of State really does say, you can apply wherever you're physically present, but it's up to the local embassies and consulates to make their own rules. So let's say you're going to a conference in Germany, or you're going to visit family in Germany, and you're not a German citizen or resident. If you can find an appointment, the consuls in Germany are encouraged to accept your visa appointment. So they will ask, what are you doing in Germany? It can't be for convenience. You can't say, oh, it's easier. I heard it's easier at the consulate in Frankfurt to get my visa. That's why I'm here. Not going to go over well. But if you say, oh, I'm visiting my cousin or my uncle, or I attended a conference, or I'm, touring around and I went, going to the museum and I had a whole thing set up, they may consider it and they may be reasonable. But we have been noticing that certain European posts have better appointment availability, but you do just have to check. And the issue is that to check all these different countries, you have to first pay the visa fee before you have access to the real calendar to book an appointment. And each fee is really limited per country. So it's not like you pay one fee and you can search all over the world. If you search Canada, you pay your fee in Canada, that's not going to transfer over, let's say, in Germany. So you've got to pay to be able to see the real-time calendar. The other thing with the other consideration, if you're applying as a third country national, is that you can't have overstayed your I-94. So a lot of times as an F1, you have a duration of status I-94. So normally that's not going to be a concern. But if you're out of status, or you changed your status and you're an overstay, even by 1 day, then you have to apply in your home country unless you qualify for a special exception. So let's move on to vaccinations and testing requirements. During the Trump administration, there was really a lot of restrictions there were geographical travel bans, and the Biden administration eased some of those, and they rescinded the geographic travel bans. There is still the requirement, though, as a non-immigrant, that you have to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And that means vaccines that are approved by the FDA or are listed for emergency use by WHO are accepted. Very hard to get around and qualify for one of the limited exceptions. So if you're not vaccinated and you travel out and you want to come back to the United States, even with a valid F1 visa, you have to be fully vaccinated or have try to qualify for an exception, which is not going to be too easy. There were some requirements that you had to have a negative COVID test before you could get on a plane. And that was stopped last summer, middle of June, except for, and you'll see the next slide, which just occurred last month because of what was going on in China. They put the testing requirement back for anybody traveling back from China. So any international travel back from China, even if you're transiting through Canada or Korea, you have to get tested before you can travel back to the United States. And that applies across the board, whether you're a non-immigrant, such as an F1, a permanent resident, or a US citizen, if you're coming back from China by air. So what are the consequences of what's going on in, with the war in Ukraine? And so if you're from Europe, if you're from Ukraine or Russia, one, if you're Russian, there's no more US consular post availability. You can't apply for a US visa anymore in Russia. And if you're Ukrainian, there haven't been the possibility of applying for visas during the war. So it put a strain on other US consular posts in the Europe region, particularly around that area. And so, consular officers really have been very difficult on student visa applicants for Russian or Ukrainian citizens because they perceive Ukrainians as potential refugees and Russians as potential asylum seekers. And as an international student, as an F1 student, there's what's called this section of law under the Immigration Act, 214B. And what that means is there's a presumption that you have immigrant intent. And you have to convince the consular officer that you don't. And that's sometimes a tough argument to make, especially as you can see, if you're from a country that's engaged in war, does the consular officer really believe that when you finish your program, you're going back to Russia or you're going to go back to Ukraine? And so there have been a lot of denials for Russians and Ukrainians for F1 visas. So it makes for a very difficult visa environment if you're applying to renew and you need to travel if you're Russian or Ukrainian. And so the Department of State has designated other consular posts to handle Russian and Ukrainian consular posts. But again, we talked about being able to apply wherever you're physically present. So if you can get into another country, it might be a better choice and give you better chances to apply for your visa. So now we'll move on to the topic of administrative processing and what that means. So we go back to the visa interview process. The consul is doing all these background checks, and that all falls under administrative processing. It could be a fraud investigation, could be security clearances, could be a legal issue. They might need more documents. And so the officer won't really tell you what type of clearance they're doing. They just frame it under this umbrella phrase of administrative processing. And though there are all these different types of security clearances, they used to tell you you're undergoing the type of clearance, and they name clearances after animals, those that fly and those that land animals. So normally the ones that fly are faster types of clearances versus the land ones. The donkey clearance would be a longer clearance. That's where you have a common name, and they have to run it through different agencies to clear you. If you've ever had a criminal issue, even if it's been resolved and dropped, or any issue, medical issues, alcohol or drug abuse, they can run various checks which can slow down the process. And so the administrative processing can take anywhere from a couple days, really easy one to resolve. Maybe they asked you forgot to bring your transcripts and they want to verify that you're a good student and looking at your grades. That's an easy one to resolve. And sometimes it's a name hit, that donkey clearance, if you have a very common name. That can take sometimes months and sometimes years to resolve. So, if you have a very common name. There's always some risk involved in the visa process. And if you're subject to one of these administrative processing, the officer just gives you a letter and it says, okay, we'll be in touch. We'll let you know when it's resolved. And sometimes it just drags on. And so what do you do? How do you resolve it? I mean, you can contact an immigration attorney. You can sometimes reach out to a local congressperson or a senator and they can make some inquiries. If it's been going on for quite a long time, and I'm talking at least 6 months or a year, you can actually sue the Department of State, and that's called a mandamus lawsuit. Not a fun thing to have to do. It's a lot of resources involved, but those are some options that you have if it gets dragged out too long. All right. Do we have any questions so far before we move on past the visa process? We're going to switch gears and talk about coming back to the United States.
Well, I've got a question that might be about coming back. Can you explain the difference or the difference in risk with visa renewal under F1 OPT in home country compared to regular cases where the applicant is still attending?
Oh, it's a good one. Okay, yeah, we could address that. So, I'm always concerned. I mean, this is as an attorney perspective, you might have a different perspective, but I'm always concerned when somebody, has graduated, they've got their OPT, hopefully they've got to have a job to be able to return to the United States for, it's a harder to prove to the consular officer at that point that you're going to go back to your home country, because to be honest, you've got your OPT. A lot of folks want to keep that job and apply for an H-1B. And I do think consular officers, most of them are fairly reasonable. They understand the big picture of how international students work and how they progress. And for the most part, it's pretty reasonable. But yeah, there is I do think it's a bit of a higher risk. There's more involved in what you have to prove, versus you're just maybe your second year into your program and you've got 2 years to go. I think if you've got good grades and your finances are good, I think the consular officer is more attuned to allow you to renew your visa so you can finish your degree. You've invested quite a bit into it. Versus, let's say you've got 2 months left of OPT, there's a higher chance, I think, a higher risk of whether the consular officer will renew the visa. And I have seen, I see the good and the bad all the time, and every so often you will see a denial in that case. But for the most part, it's pretty rare. But it is something you have to take into account, and it's always a balancing test. How important is it for you to take that international trip if you don't have a valid F1 visa, and are you willing to take the risk that a visa officer could tell you no, and now you've lost out on the tail end of your OPT and maybe the potential for cap. If you're filing for an H-1B, it could impact you. So again, it boils down to understand the risk. Try to minimize international travel if you don't have a valid visa. If you've got to make the trip, then you're going to have to take that risk. I don't know if you have a different perspective.
No, I think that there's a follow-up question too, is what happens if your appointment or interview is canceled or if you're denied?
So if the first part's easier. If your appointment's canceled, well, then you're going to have to wait. If your visa is expired, you're going to be waiting abroad until you can get a new visa appointment and then get your visa issued. So that's why, planning is important and understanding there could be delays and cancellations. We take it a next step. You get denied. You don't have a way to get back to the United States without a valid visa. Toward the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the waiver process. Customs and Border Protection has the discretion to waive somebody in who does not have a valid visa, but it's quite rare and it's quite a difficult feat to pull off. So I wouldn't count on that. You really would have to have some very, very strong equities and show, why this consular officer really was out of their league to deny. So it's going to be very difficult. So that's the risk, is if they do say no, you're stuck until you're able to get a new visa issued, if at all.
So given those risks, would you advise us to try not to travel while they're working on OPT unless they really have to?
Yeah, I would. I would try to minimize travel if you just want to go on vacation and go to Paris for 2 weeks for vacation. I would try to discourage it. If your employer says, we need you to take a business trip and it's your job on the line, then you've got to take that into consideration. If there's a family medical emergency, that's a different story. I mean, it's really a personal decision, not one I can answer. It's just I can advise there's risk involved. And if you're willing to understand that, there's a chance you may not get back. Even if it's minimal, there is a chance. And it just really does vary too by the countries, where you're applying, what your citizenship is, where you're applying, and what your individual circumstances are. But at the end of the day, it is an individual decision. Yes. So,
Can you repeat?
oh yeah, so the question was, so let's say you've finished your OPT and you're moving on to an H-1B and you want to apply for your visa. Is that a better option for you? And I would say yes, because the H-1B is a dual intent visa. And so those 214B considerations are not taken into account. When you're applying for your H-1B visa, they're looking at, your credentials. Do you have your degree? Are you in status? Is your employer legitimate? Everything's good. But you don't have to convince them that you're going home upon completion of your H-1B. You could have a green card in process. You could be a day away from getting a green card. They could still approve an H-1B visa. So the H-1B is a much stronger visa category and different type of considerations. But, going back to the administrative processing, all those things could still, come into play. All these clearances and checks still have to be done by the consular officer. And so there could be other types of delays, but the denial based on 214B grounds is not a factor for an H-1B.
Here's another H-1B. I'm an H-1B visa holder, and recently my department here at UC Davis submitted my green card request. Should I cancel my plans to get my visa stamped, like this visa renewal, until I have some progress on the green card?
Yeah, so I same thing, because the H-1B is not, we don't have to factor in 214B considerations. The fact that you have a green card in play should not impact the visa application. You do have to disclose, depending how far you are in the green card process. So let's say there's, if it's a labor certification or there was an I-140 immigrant visa petition filed, there is a question, has anyone ever filed an immigrant visa petition on your behalf? So you always want to be honest on your DS-160 application and say, yes, university filed this petition or it's been approved or pending. But, the consul just wants to know about it, but it shouldn't be a negative factor whatsoever in the visa process when you're on the H-1. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So every visa category has different dates in terms of when you can apply. It's more lenient for F1s and J1s. I think it's 90 and 120 days out. And so for the H-1B, you can apply in advance. They can issue the visa, but you can only enter the country with an H-1B visa 10 days in advance of your start date. So usually with cap gap cases, so if you're F1 and you're going from OPT to H-1, you're going to have an October 1 start date. So let's say you get your visa issued September the 1st, right? Or August or whatever day. You can't use that visa to enter the United States until September 21, 10 days before October 1. So on that date, that's the earliest, or you can come any day after as long as your H-1B visa is valid. You can apply earlier, to try. But let's say you're on F1, and you've got an H1, that's an even tougher one. Then they're going to say, okay, you've got the H1, we want you to wait until that date. They may not issue your F1, or sometimes they may say, hey, you've got the H1B anyways, we might allow you to keep your F1 intact. So those are different considerations too. Yeah, it's a lot to juggle. Yeah. Yes. No, you don't have to. We're talking about only if you want to apply for a visa during that time. So if you got selected in the H-1B selection, the employer filed your H-1 and you have an October 1 start date and they gave you an I-94, you're good. You know, come October 1st, you're in H-1B status. You don't have to travel. It's just if you elect to travel out to be able to come back for an October 1, you only have a 10-day window prior to that. But there's, you know, if you were in status and they approved it as change of status, there's no requirement. Now, sometimes there may be a gap or there were some issues with your status and they might not approve you for an I-94. And so to effectuate your H-1B status, then you would have to apply for your visa, return back to the US get an I-94, and then you're in H-1B status. So, you know, if no issues with your status and you're able to do change of status, you don't have to travel. It's only if you want to be able to travel and come back. Was there any question in the back or we covered it? All good? Okay.
I've got a couple. What do you want to ask them now? or-
Yeah, we can do it. I think we're okay.
What is the U.S. Department of Homeland Security travel redress inquiry?
I think we'll save that because that's not necessarily the visa question. We'll save that to the end.
When is the best time to have the appointment for a visa renewal, given that we're lucky to get a summer internship? I guess, yeah, we're lucky to get summer. Is there a time of the year that's better than others to have a?
I mean, they're always going to be busiest around the holiday season. So in the winter, December is a busy season for consuls. And also from a student perspective, summer, a lot of times right before, end of summer, depending on when school starts, and early fall. So that's their busy time. So, but they do try to prioritize. I always hear from the visa folks, from Department of State, they try their best to prioritize F1 international students and to make the most appointments available that they can. And they do say, if you can't get a good appointment, to reach out and request the expedite. And it's always going to be easier in your home country to get those expedites than as a third country national, because they're really geared towards prioritizing their services for people that live in their district. So, if you're trying to get an expedite at the US consulate in Vancouver and you're from France, they're going to say, our job is to prioritize those that are living in Canada, in our region. You've got to have a really strong reason why you can't go back to Paris and apply there. All right. So now, oh, yes, go ahead. Well, it really does depend on your circumstances, status. But if you have no issues with your status, then you can take the option of possibly applying in Canada. If it's a renewal, so if you're renewing your F1, or if Mexico opens up again, possibly renewing in Mexico. From the advisor side, the reason being is from a risk perspective, right? Let's say you go to Mexico City or you go to Tijuana to apply for your visa and you get denied your visa and your visa is expired and they cancel it. Now what? You're stuck in Mexico. You don't want to be stuck. I don't want to be stuck in Mexico. You want to be stuck in Mexico. There's some dangerous places in Mexico. Not so bad to be stuck in Canada, but there is the risk. And so that sometimes factors into it. I've helped many people apply in Mexico over the years. I've helped many people apply in Canada. And sometimes, we prefer it from the attorney perspective, because sometimes consuls we know of a particular post or certain visa officers might be more reasonable. But really, it's a more straightforward application when you're in your home country. But, the U.S. consulate in Vancouver sees a lot of international applicants because, just to put it into perspective, Canadians, for the most part, don't need visas. So Canadian citizens. So the majority of people that live in Canada are Canadian citizens. So they don't need visas unless they have certain issues. So all the people that are applying at the consulate in Canada, normally they're going to be Canadian residents. So they're there as permanent residents or they're there on their, student visa or work visas that want to come to the US. And then they see the third country nationals as well. So they see a fair share of third country nationals. All the US consular posts in Canada are familiar with that. But again, the first question they may ask is, why are you here? Why didn't you apply in your home country? What's the reason? And if you can say, well, it's more difficult back home, I don't think they'll give me my visa, they're not going to like that. But if you say, I have a conference in London that I'd like to go, and I needed to take care of my US visa, I wanted to make sure I had it before I traveled, there might be a good reason and they'll understand. So it really just depends on the circumstances. All right. So we'll have some time too. If you think of additional questions at the end on the visa side, you can also ask. So now we'll talk about getting back into the United States. You went through the visa process, you have a valid visa, how do you get back? Well, there's really two main ways. There's a third by sea, but it's still a similar process. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, these are the part of Department of Homeland Security. They enforce the admission process. So a visa is your ticket to get on an airplane to show the airline that you can board a plane. And the CBP officer is looking at your visa, and they're the final gatekeeper. They're going to decide, am I going to let this person into the United States? Even if you have a valid visa, they can cancel your visa, they can send you back home. It's not a guarantee that you're getting into the United States. They're going to be the judge of it. And they do their own security checks. So let's say you want to drive up to to Vancouver, or you want to drive down to Tijuana. You're going to be processing with CBP at the land border if you travel by car. And surprisingly, I've heard, I think it happens more for Southern California students, they're not familiar with the San Diego area. It's very easy to cross into Mexico and not even realize it. So just word of caution, if you're driving, be very careful as you get close to the border, because you can end up in Mexico quite easy. And if you don't have your documents with you, you end up in trouble. And so with CBP at the border, they charge a $6 fee to print or process your I-94. And when you fly back by air, those I-94 fees are already built into your ticket. So if you ever looked at all the details of the breakdown of fees, all that's built in to your flight ticket. And so if you're flying back from Canada, we have what's called pre-flight inspection. You have US CBP officers at most of the major airports in Canada, and some other airports throughout the world have pre-flight inspection, but you get an online I-94 when you're flying back versus driving back. One of the new things that we're seeing just recently is this pilot program on behalf of CBP, and they're trying to eliminate the use of even admission stamps and passports. This is being piloted at 16 of the major airports. I think most of the Canadian pre-flight inspection and most of your major US airports like LAX, SFO, are doing away with the stamps. The border crossings, there are 7 border crossings that are not stamping: San Diego, Seattle, Buffalo, Laredo, Tucson, El Paso, Detroit. So what that means is, I would recommend that you want to retain your flight itinerary, your boarding passes, screenshot. Most of everything's the app these days, so screenshot your boarding passes. Keep recent, once you're in the US, credit card purchases. The reason being is sometimes CBP makes mistakes on your admission dates or your admission categories. And so if you need proof and you don't have that admission stamp that you were stamped in F1 status or whatever your visa categories, you don't have proof you're here in the right category or the right day. So keep all that information in case there's a mistake in the system, and they do make mistakes. They've created this CBP One mobile app, so you can download their app. They're trying to expand the use of that. And then I printed out, or I listed the link here where you can print out or save electronically your I-94. And so whenever you enter the US, you want to be able to check your I-94, make sure they did admit you the right date, the right visa category. And so you still can request that the CBP officer stamp your passport. So even if they say, no, we're not stamping anymore, you can say, could you please stamp my passport? I would like to have that for my records. And they are supposed to still do it if you formally request it. But if you just give them your paperwork, they're going to do their work. and process you, and they may not stamp you if you don't actually request it. So I would say if you're not in a rush, it's probably a good idea to put in the formal request to have that admission stamp in your passport. All right, so this CBP inspection process works is that anytime you show up at a US port of entry, you have to be inspected by a CBP officer to get admitted legally into the United States. And so what are they doing? Why do we have this process? One is they want to verify your identity. So you have your passport, you've got your visa, all those contain biometric information. They're verifying it's really you and somebody else isn't using your passport to sneak into the US. They're checking admissibility. Similar to what a consular officer did in their processes, they want to make sure that you don't pose a threat to the United States and that you are entitled to be able to come in. And then they're making sure that you don't have any, from a customs perspective, they're making sure you're not bringing anything that's prohibited into the United States. What do they ask? They're asking, what is your citizenship? What visa do you hold? Are you bringing anything back with you that you didn't have when you left the United States? So they want to know, what is it that you have? There's different, from a customs perspective, if you have too much money, you have to declare a certain amount of money. Otherwise, you risk it being forfeited. A lot of times I'm asked, well, do I have to answer their questions? This officer is asking me 100 different questions. Do I have to answer? Well, you do have the right to remain silent and not answer. But if you're an international student and you're not a US citizen, they're very likely going to cancel your visa and send you on the next plane home. So you have to take that all into account. You're probably better off, unless you really don't want to answer their questions. You don't want to be in the US to answer their questions. Now, there's what's called secondary screening. So if you're coming in at the airport, there's the primary officer, right? They're at the booth, they take your documents, they look at it. And if they have further questions for you or they need to do additional screening, they're going to send you off to secondary screening, which could be an office that looks like this. The officers are up at a table and they're processing people. And it could be an hour, 2 hours as you wait for them to take your documents, check their computer. They may ask you a few questions, they may ask you nothing. But oftentimes you're going to see this if, for instance, let's say you forgot to bring your most recent I-20 with you, or your I-20 didn't have a travel signature, and you're able to board the plane, get on the plane, and land. And so that could be a reason why they sent you to secondary, and they may ask you to submit additional documents at a later point. Maybe your name matches something in the database, and that it's a common name. I remember one of the consuls, the chief consul at the embassy in Mexico City, said, they had somebody who, by the name of Maria Ruiz, was a very common name for Mexican visa applicants. And, a lot of times they had to subject these folks to security clearances because there was a bad guy in the system named Maria Ruiz. And so even if it was somebody who was 80 years old, grandma who had no record, they couldn't tell because they don't know who the bad guy Maria Ruiz was. There wasn't any other identifying factors. And so the same thing happens when you come in with CBP. They have to make sure that this person, even if they have a common name and there's a hit on that name, that the person before them is not the bad guy. If you've ever had any prior issues with your status, if there was SEVIS termination in your past, or there were other status violations, that's going to show up in the CBP database, and they may refer you to a secondary to go through your immigration history and ask you questions. If you've ever had any problems with police, that's going to show up, and they may, send you to secondary. The reason they send you to secondary is they're trying to keep their line moving. They've got a line of people that just came off the airplane, and they don't have time to get into all the details. So at secondary, that's where they get into the details about any particular issues. And sometimes it's just a random search. You won't even know, most of the time everything goes through smoothly. This one particular time you got sent to secondary, it also could be just at random. So besides the inspection, CBP also can do searches. And this happens at the airport, could happen at the land port. I've had my bags, searched by CBP, and particularly during the last administration, it's still carrying on. We're seeing more and more searches. And a lot of times the issue could also be electronic searches. So besides just your bag and personal possessions, they are searching electronic devices. So it could be if you're carrying your laptop, cell phones, and they can search all of these things. And so The selection for the searches really is not supposed to be on basis of religion, race, national origin, gender, political beliefs. They have to have some reason why, or it could be completely random, but they're not supposed to single you out. You know, you're from France, everybody from France we're doing searches of, but they have to have the reasons. Even I, as a U.S. citizen, can, you know, like I said, I can have my phone searched or my laptop searched. I, as an attorney, have a different way to get around it. But if you're not a U.S. citizen, you know, you're probably going to be denied entry if you refuse. If you say, no, I don't give you permission to search my phone or my laptop, they'll say, okay, but cancel visa, go back home. That's probably what's going to happen. So yes, you have rights, but they're kind of limited rights in terms of, you know, balancing your ability to travel back to the United States. The other thing to consider is when you're coming back to the United States, you're not yet on US soil. Even though you are, you haven't yet been admitted. And so what that means is there's no right to immigration counsel. You can't call me or another immigration attorney and say, I'm stuck here at secondary. They're asking me all these questions. Can you help? I wish I could. I wish I could come to the airport and, you know, appear before the immigration officer on my client's behalf. But unfortunately, they don't allow it because you're sort of in this gray area, this twilight zone between the US and not the US. And so they won't allow attorney representation in the admission process. There's a little bit of leeway when you're coming in at the land port of entry. I do still travel with clients. And if I'm in the vehicle with my client, they have to send me into the secondary inspection with my client. And so at least I'm in the waiting area and I'm there and I can observe what's going on. But at the airport, even if I'm next to you at the airport, we flew together, we get off the airplane, they see my passport, they'll say, okay, you can go through. I can't go into the secondary inspection with my client. Now, sometimes if there is an issue, they may admit you temporarily and they'll tell you to go to what's called a deferred inspection meeting. These are typically at the local immigration offices in big cities. And so you would talk to a CBP officer in person where they can review your documents and your situation more in person and spend more time. And so if they did schedule you for deferred inspection, there you can have an attorney accompany you and represent you at a deferred inspection meeting. The scope of the representation is limited. It's really there as an observer. They don't like the attorney to talk too much, but I do think it makes a difference when interacting with CBP that the attorney is present. Some are, you know, more reasonable than others, and they'll allow a lot more interaction than, and it really just depends who you get. And so the other option too is they might allow you, if there are issues that come up, they might allow you to withdraw your application for admission. They might cancel your visa. Worst case scenario is they give you what's called expedited removal, and they're basically giving you a bar from being able to come back to the United States. If you had criminal issues, there's chance they're going to take you into custody. So it's very important if ever you run into problems with police, you know, to be in touch both with criminal defense attorneys as well as run your issues by an immigration attorney as well. We talked about issues coming back to the US. So let's say, you know, your I-20 expired, you didn't have your travel signature. They might issue you this form I-515 and ask you to submit your documents for further processing. They admit you for 30 days, and then you've got that time to get your documents from, you know, from your advisor and get that into them in time. It used to be you had to go in person. I think now it's all being done by mail. So, you know, what are the possible outcomes at the port of entry? Well, this is a list from best to worst. Best is you go through, you're admitted, everything went fine. None of these things we talked about occurred. They scanned your passport, your visa, you're in, no problem. Sometimes, like I said, they do make mistakes. They might admit you in the wrong visa category, might admit you for the wrong status. So you want to make sure that you are DS and not for a date certain. You know, we talked about a little bit earlier on the visa side of things. Well, what happens if I get denied? Or maybe you didn't get denied, but for whatever reason you forgot it, that you needed a valid visa to get back, and somehow you were able to board the plane. Maybe you were ESTA eligible, or you know, you had a valid visitor visa and you got on the plane and you show up with your I-20, an expired F1 visa, and you go, oh, my visa's expired. If you get a really nice officer, which isn't too common these days, they might waive you in. So they do have the ability, where you could, this form I-193, where you pay a fee, and they can waive the requirement of a valid visa and admit you in F1 status. It's quite rare, but it does happen, and I've pulled off a few miracles over the years of getting folks readmitted in F1 status without visas, but it's a tough one. Bottom line is, renew your visa or have a valid visa, F1 visa, if you're coming back in F1 status. Secondary inspection, we talked about details about that. Deferred inspection, withdraw your application, expedited removal. If you're claiming asylum, they'll refer you to an asylum officer. If for some reason you had problems in the past with immigration and you had a removal order, you might be reactivating an old removal order. Worst case scenario is being detained, and that normally happens for those that have very serious criminal issues. And then you're waiting to talk to an immigration judge to see if they're going to be able to get you out on bond. All right, wrapping up before we go into more Q&A. So what role do I play as an immigration attorney in this whole process? The DS-160, it seems straightforward, but there's a lot of tricky questions. And so we do help out with review and preparation of giving feedback on DS-160s for different visa applications. We put together legal briefs for the consular officer, really packaging up all the what we think are the critical information that the consul wants to see, indexing it and putting together a short attorney letter, helping the visa applicant through the process of preparing for the visa interview, strategies, procedures, reviewing interview questions, really, doing prep sessions. And over the years, like I had mentioned earlier, to the extent allowed, and it's not so much, most consular posts now don't allow the attorneys inside. I can get as far as security and check-in, but I used to actually be able to go inside many of the consular posts with my client and be at the window during the visa process. I'm still holding out hope that that's going to come back someday. Policies change all the time, and so we keep up to speed with all of that, and we give feedback on visa process, procedures, issues. Going back to that one question, what do I do in the event of a visa denial? That's something definitely where it's important to consult with an immigration attorney and see, is this fixable? Is there a path to possibly overcoming the concern that the consular officer had with the visa application? We talked about administrative processing and security checks, and when it does drag on too long, we can also inquire on our client's behalf as far as what is the status of the check, and trying to get through to the embassy or consulate to try to get that security check process quicker. And then finally, if you do get sent to deferred inspection or you wanted assistance at a land border, possibly helping with CBP in that regard. So that's the presentation. Now we can run through some questions. You've got, a list here of all our different offices throughout the US, and we also have our Shanghai office in China. Again, my contact info, avi@wolfstorff.com. And then our website has a lot of good information. I would encourage you, if you're interested, we send out updates all the time, when breaking news happens, we have different blogs. If you want to sign up, you're always welcome to sign up and get our email bulletins as well. There's no charge for that. So I know we had a question about DHS TRIP. So I think now's a good time after we went through the CBP process. And so first of all, what is TRIP? So TRIP is the Traveler Redress Program. And so let's say, you've got a valid F1 visa, and every time you travel into the United States, you get sent to secondary, and there's no reason. Like, maybe it's a random, or you have a common name, or you just can't make sense of why it's happening. You can submit a TRIP redress. So you go online and you submit all the requirements, and you're letting them know, you're letting Department of Homeland Security know that you're having these issues when you travel. TRIP sounds great, but what happens after they reviewed it, a few months later, you get back this mysterious letter from Department of Homeland Security, and it says, we can neither confirm nor deny that we've done anything, but you might experience some better processing. So there's no harm in trying TRIP, if you've encountered travel issues. I think most of the US airlines have a space in your profile where you can actually put in your TRIP number. what extent that actually helps, I don't know, but again, it doesn't hurt. And you really won't know if it helped until you come in the next time at the airport. If you got something secondary, probably didn't help. If you, breeze on through, then it might have cleared up something. So that's what DHS trip is. And I wish it was a clearer, more defined process, but it is pretty vague in terms of what you get back from DHS. Okay.
Here's a question about administrative processing. What if a person's been waiting for a month and there's still no updates on the application?
So each consular post usually will, if they've started administrative processing, they're supposed to give you a letter, and it'll say 221G, and it should have contact information on there, whether it's an email address or a link. So most US embassies or consulates will have an email, or they'll have an online way to contact the consular post visa unit and to submit your inquiry. Normally 30 days, I know it seems like a lot, especially when you're a student, but in the visa world, it's not that long. And the consuls probably aren't going to treat such, an inquiry after 30 days with much urgency. When it gets to maybe 60, 90 days, it bumps up, I think, another level. And of course, the longer it goes. But yeah, that's part of the risk with the visa process, is that you could be stuck in this, prolonged administrative processing, and you just never know how long it's going to be. Now, sometimes if in the past, when you applied for prior US visas, you've had delays, that's a good key that on your next application, you're likely to encounter such a delay again. It doesn't mean just because they cleared you the first time, your next one is going to go any quicker or any smoother. So, take that into account. If you had administrative processing on a prior visa, you've got to factor that into your next visa application as well.
Okay. Here's a question from a person who has been given a postdoc here on campus to start, and they can't book a day one interview appointment. There's no dates available.
Again, just try to book the first available spot. And, after that, put in the request for an expedite if the date doesn't work. And again, I know it's easier said than done, but consider another consular jurisdiction. So, I don't know their specifics, but, look at Canada, or look at possibly other posts where they have better visa availability.
Okay. This person had applied for an H-1B before, but they never got a visa stamp. And now they're applying for an F-1 visa instead. Are there any risks having applied for an H-1B in the past?
So, I do think consular officers look at your history. And so, again, we go back to this concept of 214B. Consuls, especially I try to break down the F-1 visa in the way consuls do. Very three simple bullets. Do you have serious student intent? So that means, are you going to what they consider a reputable school? Are you really studying something that makes sense with your history? Because I've seen some crazy fact patterns where people get degrees. I don't know how it works, but you get a bachelor's degree, or you get a master's, and then you're bouncing to an English language school. So there might be some valid reasons, but again, put yourself on that. We go back to the beginning when I showed you the glass. Put yourself on the other side of the glass from the consular officer's perspective. How can you justify this? How does your history make sense? And so, if there's a reason why the H-1B didn't work out, and now you can say, well, I needed a master's or a PhD. This has always been my dream to get a degree from X school. And it makes sense, then the consul is going to believe it. But if they think you're just trying to prolong your stay in the United States, that's going to be really difficult. I'm kind of moving on to another topic, but one of the things, and I see this, denial of fact pattern quite often is, as you graduate, and it's tough to navigate with the H-1B lottery because, last year it was about a 28 or 30, depending if you have a master's or not, anywhere between 28 to a third chance of getting selected in the H-1B lottery. And so what we did see, a lot of international students went to what's called day one CPT schools. This is just basically a way to prolong your stay and be able to work in the United States. Consuls do not like it. You know, they don't like these day one CPT. And more likely than not, if you have a day one CPT school that issued you an I-20 and you apply for a visa, probably not going to get the F1 visa. But, you know, if you had, you know, if you can show a natural progression, so you did your bachelor's, you did OPT, maybe you had an H-1B, and now you want to do a master's or another level or take another something else that's interesting, and you can justify it to them, it's got to be reasonable. But if they feel that you're just trying to prolong your stay in the US and you're getting an I-20 to buy yourself more time, then it's a good chance they may deny you. You know, consuls really understand the big picture, the visa process, and they're looking at your individual circumstances, and they kind of know, you know, what's legit and what's not, at least from their perspective. Yes.
So, success rates?
On the visa side?
Yeah.
Okay. So to repeat the question, you know, is there a difference in how consuls look at somebody who's just got their bachelor's degree and moves on to an H-1B, or they've got a master's or higher and applying for the H-1B? And my perspective is no, because the minimum requirement for an H-1B is just a US bachelor's degree or its equivalent. So let's say, you know, you've got, we'll say engineering degree, right? So you got your bachelor's in engineering, you've got an engineering job, whether you have a master's or bachelor's, doesn't matter, right? As long as you yourself have a minimum US bachelor's or equivalent in engineering, you're going to qualify for that position if that's what they're requiring. So, you know, I don't think that's so much their consideration. It's just, well, let's say you have a bachelor's in accounting and it was an engineering position. They're going to say, wait a minute, first, it probably wouldn't get through USCIS, but let's say it got approved. The consul is going to look at it too and say, wait a minute, your degree doesn't match the position. So from that perspective, you know, the degree and the job have to have a match. So they're just called first day CPT, which means you get an I-20, you show up. There's certain requirements for in-person, but they authorize curricular practical training. So it's kind of a, you know, a way for people that don't have paths to be able to stay in the US, but a lot of times USCIS doesn't like it, CBP doesn't like it. There's a lot of phony schools out there because you really have to make sure that you're in full compliance with requirements. And a lot of times there's in-person requirements for these schools. And so people don't do the in-person, they just work. It's a way to work. They don't do the academic side. It'll catch up with the F1. And, you know, there've been DHS, CBP, or ICE have put on, you know, they create fake schools and they give you these I-20s and you think you're in school and then you end up in deportation proceedings. So, you know, it's really these sort of, you know, last ditch efforts to be able to remain in the US. But from the government's perspective, there are some legitimate ones out there, some schools, but a lot of times people don't comply with all the rules and you end up in trouble. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
I have one question.
Oh, the pilot, yes.
Yeah, I just came from this
Mhm. Right. Yeah, so you could, yeah, so if, I mean, you don't have to have that admission stamp. Did you check your online R94? Is everything okay? Okay, so as long, I mean, you don't, if the I-94 shows you as F1 duration of status and it shows your entry date is correct, you're okay, even without that admission stamp. The reason I like the admission stamp is that if there was a problem, let's say they admitted you J1 or they admitted you B2 and they admitted you for 6 months instead of F1 DS, you know, how do you go back? And you've got to go probably try to get it fixed either online or go in person to deferred inspection to get the I-94 corrected. And so it's tough if you don't have the admission stamp and you don't have all these, you didn't keep your boarding pass, you don't have your travel itinerary, how do you prove that you came in with the right category? So, but if you checked your I-94, don't worry about it. On future trips, you may ask, I understand you're trying to save ink, but if you don't mind, if you would please stamp, they'll say yes or no. They might send you to secondary and you'd have to wait for it. So it's kind of your decision. But yeah, if everything's good, then you should be okay. It's more so just to be safe, in case they do make a problem, a mistake on it. Yes. So that's a whole nother presentation, but to put it, the question is, I'm on a J1, I'm subject to 212E, which is the 2-year home residency requirement. When should I look at waiver options? It's really up to you. The easy thing that I can say is you can go back home and serve the 2 years in your home country, and that'll do away with. What that means is you cannot apply for a green card. You cannot change status in the US, and you're not eligible for an H visa or an L visa until you either comply or you get a waiver. There's different ways you can get waivers. But the thing is, once you start the way, let's say you have a path to a waiver. I don't know the specifics, if you have government funding or why your skills list. There's different reasons why you might be subject to 212E. But timing of a waiver application also becomes an issue from a visa perspective, right? Because if you file for a waiver, you're basically, in the consul's mind, you're telling them you want to stay in the US. Maybe I want to get a green card, or I want to progress to a different work visa. And again, what is the point of the J1? The J1 is called the exchange visitor visa. They issued this visa category because they want you to take whatever knowledge or skills you learn in the United States and apply that back home when you finish your program stateside. That's the whole point of why we have the J1. And so, when you apply for a waiver, the consul says, okay, that's telling me you want to stay longer in the United States. And that if you need to renew your J1 visa, it's going to be very difficult after you started the waiver process, or if you travel back. So you have to take timing into when you apply for the waiver into account. And if you need to renew, did you get a 1 year or 5 year, or how many year visa did you get on the J1? So you probably got a year visa. Yeah. So I don't know how long your program is or your specifics, but let's say you want to renew again next year, if there's a renewal option. If you apply for your waiver too soon, prospects for getting your J renewed are not going to be so great. So normally when we see waiver cases, they're more towards the end, getting closer to when you're actually done with your program, getting close to, not having to travel anymore, where you can spend time, because the waiver process can take many months.
So can I end my program before that? I want to go back. Back my passport visa, I can end it.
I don't think so. It's just if you finish your program early and you leave, you're not going to be able to return back to the United States in J status. I think that would be the only issue. But if you finish your program early, no problem, right? Going back sooner, I don't think there's any issue. It'll get updated, Welcome. Yes. So the question is, if you have an H-1B and you have dependents outside the country, how can they apply for the visa? And so, they still have to go through the whole visa process, pay the fee, DS-160, get an appointment. They're going to need a copy of your H-1B approval notice, proof of your H-1B status. And we talked about critical documents. If it's a spouse, marriage certificate, minor children, birth certificates. And so they will have to schedule the appointments and have the interviews. And typically the consular officer, one, they're looking at proving the relationship, right? Is this your child or is this your spouse? That's number one. And then two, they're looking at you, make sure that your H-1B is legitimate, you qualify. So they're going to need copies of your petition and all your supporting documents. If you've already started your H-1B, they'll want to see like payroll records, W-2s, maybe an updated, is it here at the university for the H-1 or is it a different employer? Yeah, so sometimes you might be able to get, a letter just confirming your position, your salary and, a letter of support for the H-4. Sometimes universities will do that, but normally otherwise it's going to be your documents. Yeah. Do we have any?
Yeah, we have a few more questions. So this is an F1 and F2, and they both had their visas revoked. The F2 left the country before they got the notice, so didn't realize it had been revoked. Can she reapply for the F2 visa?
Wow, that's a tough one. So my thoughts on visa revocation, number one, if you're in the United States and your visa gets revoked, the revocation is not supposed to be effective until you depart the United States. So the F1 is still in F1 status as long as they're on US soil. The tough part from the visa world is the consul may say, we don't want to issue your F2 visa until your spouse shows up and we determine their eligibility for the F1 visa. So there's no prohibition against the F2, I don't know, spouse or dependent or child, spouse applying for their F2 visa. But my hunch would be the consul is probably either going to put them into administrative processing, or they may deny them under 214B until the principal, the F1 shows up. And, I don't know the particulars here, but, there's normally something in the system that causes the revocation. It could be a security concern, it could be a criminal issue. And a lot of times when there's revocation, those are really tough to fix and get overturned. So I would say for the F1 spouse that's here in status, if they travel out trying to help their spouse, there's high risk. They're going to be delayed or denied. But again, that's probably something they should talk to, SISS about, or as well consult with an immigration attorney to go through the circumstances to see if we can figure out. Sometimes we don't know and it's mysterious, and you'll never know until you show up for your visa interview and you get a mysterious denial letter. It could be, they suspect drugs, money laundering, security issues, terrorism. And a lot of times, I get clients who tell me I have no involvement in all this, but it's very hard to prove the negative. It's hard to prove that you're not, or Department of State or whoever put something into the database says that you are. And it's really an uphill battle, and you could be out for years and years or forever trying to fix something like that. So unfortunately, it's a really difficult one. Yes.
A question about traffic tickets. Are they considered convictions that would be reported when they're doing these?
So that really, it's not necessarily an immigration issue. I do think, there's different reasons you can get a traffic ticket, right? So you ran a stop sign. That's to me not an issue. That's not a criminal matter. But what if you're going 100 in a 30-mile zone? Every county, every state's going to have different rules, and so that's something you've got to check with a criminal defense attorney, whether that amounts to an infraction, a misdemeanor, a felony. So normally people will come to me and let me know, and then I can give advice from the immigration perspective. Or sometimes even like alcohol offenses can fall under a traffic violation, a DUI, and that's definitely going to factor both criminal and a health issue. And that, that I do see, a lot of cases where people do have DUIs, even if it's a false, the arrest for DUI and eventually maybe the police made a mistake, and the case gets dropped completely. But just having an arrest for a DUI normally results in a visa revocation. Right off the bat, the information when you get booked by the police, even if later on, the police made a mistake and they drop all the charges, the second the arrest happens and it shows as a DUI, all those records from a police station gets sent to the FBI. FBI database uploads into the Department of State, and your local U.S. embassy or consulate who issued your visa will get notice that somebody they issued a visa to got arrested for a DUI. They don't know what the outcome was, but the second they see the arrest, that visa becomes revoked. And so, regardless of the outcome, the DUI case is really, that's something you definitely you would want to consult with a defense attorney and an immigration attorney about the impact of international travel. We're going back to, traffic violations. Normally, if it's something really minor, a very minor speeding ticket or a red light or a stop sign, something like that, that's not going to be an arrest, but it does really depend on where it occurred and the local rules. So it's kind of a crossroads between criminal and immigration, and we'd have to look at the specifics to really give advice. But minor things, let's say in California, stop sign violation is not going to be an issue, but a reckless driving has a crossover into the criminal world. Yeah.
Here's a question. This is an F1 OPT student who's working for a U.S. company but working remotely outside of the U.S. Is this likely to affect their ability to states?
I'll say yes. And both are welcome to chime in, but my take and my understanding of OPT is the whole point of OPT is to be working for a U.S. company while in the United States. So if you can do this work remotely outside the United States, then from a consul perspective, they're going to say, why do you need an F1 visa? Why do you need to get back into the U.S. if you can do this outside the U.S.? Our take. Yeah, it's a good question. I think especially in today's world where we're going remote, but the U.S. still hasn't evolved into the hybrid system, and they don't allow, the concept of work is very limited. And if you're on U.S. soil and you're doing U.S. work in the United States, whether for a company in the U.S. or abroad, no matter where you're getting paid from, you need a proper work visa, be it OPT, EAD, or an H-1B type visa.
That's everything. A few other things that are not travel or safety.
I see.
So questions.
Okay. Anything else from the live audience? Yeah.
Like,
No questions are silly. They're always good.
yeah, I mean, I say I'll tell you. So while I was filling my DS-116 form, my social media account information. So, I mean, I do have Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram and stuff. I'm active on Twitter and LinkedIn, but I don't use my Instagram. So while filling out that form, I realized I don't even have my Instagram. Time I keep deleting. So in that case, what should I do? Because this time I remember I just signed.
So on your DS-160, did you list your Instagram or not?
I think I
You
did.
did. So I would, yeah. Yeah, so the question is on the DS-160, what do you do about your social media and your identifiers? And to the extent you know it, you list it. If you don't know it or it's not an active account, you wouldn't be able to list it. But the key would be to be consistent across DS-160s, because consular officers, can cross-reference. And so, let's say on a subsequent visa application, you now listed it and they say, hey, why didn't you list it last time? Your explanation, I think, is viable. I deleted my account, or I couldn't, I'm not active on that particular app, but I wanted to update it for this application. That would make sense. They're more concerned when you have a really active account and you're hiding it from them. you know, you'd be surprised, consuls do check social media. You know, anything public facing, if you have Facebook, you have Instagram, I'm not big on the different apps, but you know, and you're posting something that could be political, or maybe it's something illegal. You know, you've got a gun in your hand. You know, it sounds silly, but people have these pictures: guns, drugs. Consuls will see that. And go, wait a minute, is this somebody I want to give a visa to, or you know, should we suspect that they're a drug dealer, money launderer, or bad guy under terrorist threat? So they're looking at they're combing all these online things to do their own checks. So, you know, I guess the moral is really be mindful of what you're posting, or what, you know, if you send something inappropriate, probably would want to delete it, especially if you're traveling back into the US, because, you know, not to forward it on, you know, as jokes, all these things, especially when you're an international student, can be very serious from the government's perspective. You might think it's some silly joke, but they take things much more seriously. So that's my advice from there. Anything else? Yes. Okay. So the question is, if I want to switch from F1 to J1, how do I do it? And so there's two options. You could do change of status from F to J. Timing sometimes is a concern because of how long immigration takes with these types of applications. Hopefully, I don't know when it'll be, there's talks of making premium processing available for change of status to F and J. So if that's the case, that's a good option. If you pay the extra money, you're going to get a decision. I think it's 30 days is the proposed premium processing. The other option is to apply for your US visa. That's used to be historically the faster option, but again, we go back to what we talked about today. And, you know, are you able to get an appointment? Are you willing to take the risk with the visa process? Does, you know, you're up against 214B, F1s, J1s, the visitor visa. These are all visa categories that are subject to the presumption of immigrant intent. So the consul, if you apply for the visa, consul will ask, why are you doing this, J? What are your plans after the J? And as we talked about, sometimes the J1 also carries the 2-year home residency requirement. I mean, it'll be the same whether you change status or apply for the visa, but you should take that into consideration as well. Yeah. Well, you could try the change of status and, you know, understand that it's going to take time to process. And there's also a risk the immigration service could say no, or it could be delays with immigration. Sometimes I've seen change of status from F to J. I mean, again, during pandemic, I was seeing like a year processing time, sometimes longer. I don't know, you know, there's been sometimes I'll see quicker, but I think it was pretty common that it could take a year. So you have to factor it in too, and you have to work with your program to see, you know, what's going to happen in that interim period before the adjudication. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. So the restriction when you're subject to 212E, you don't have the option to change your status within the United States. So if you did want to pursue the F1, it would have to be through going back to a US embassy or consulate. So you would need your I-20 and you would apply for the F1 visa at the US embassy or consulate. There's no restriction from the visa side for the F1. So even if you're J1 subject, you could still apply for the F1 visa. But you're not allowed to do change of status from within the United States.
No more questions. please.
Okay, that's fine. All right, I think we're good.
Okay, no more questions online. So Avi, thank you very much. I think that does it. I'm going to end the